Caherlic, and thank you all for your submissions, and I absolutely agree this is a critical conversation. Indeed, the Minister has said himself that the raison d'etre for setting up of the new department is to get the funding model right, and this is an opportunity for us to do that. Now, I am very disappointed that despite the Minister promising month after month after month to have the economic analysis from the EU Commission, I think we could be having a much better informed conversation here were we to have that economic analysis in front of us and to save us reinventing the wheel. I do welcome that the Minister has taken the loan scheme off the table. 100%. If we were to look in terms of a loan scheme for a nurse in a public institute for higher education, she or he would come out of college €12,000 in debt, or 27,000 out of a for-profit private college. I think it's very important that we agree on that from the outset. Now, in looking at what you're saying, because this does really present a stark picture when we look at the funding per student, 37% less funding per student today than it was in 2008. And we know all the advances, all the technology, all of those investments that have needed to be made in higher education. And I suppose my first question, and the difficulty I have is reconciling this, because I think if we're going to have a proper discussion about this, we need to be honest. We need to be honest across the board. So the Minister will say that he is providing the greatest level of funding to third level education this year than ever before. So this is what people are hearing. And yet when we look under the bonnet, we see that per student, and I want to know in that 37% the per student figure, two things I suppose. Does that include COVID funding, and how much of that is outside the standstill costs? I'm trying to get at how much actually goes to the student. So maybe just talk to that for a moment in terms of the standstill costs and the 37%. Maybe Mr. Miley, Professor Miley, first.
Thank you, Deputy. Yeah, so the challenge last year, our member universities took in just short of 10% extra students on a full-time equivalent basis in a single year. I mean, it was an extraordinary, there was the normal growth, if you call it that, and then we had the extra numbers arising from the great inflation and COVID, and we were asked on two occasions by the system to provide extra places, and on both occasions responded favourably. So if you look at the headline figure for the increase in funding last year, it looks attractive. But when you put in the fact that you're paying for 10% extra students, and you put in the fact that the national pay agreements, which we have no control over, government set the rates for our staff, and we must pay them. The net increase in the core grant for the 8 institutions that we represent was €22 per student. That's what it came to. So it effectively stands still is what we're talking about. And that is the reality. And in fact, if you look at national pay awards, the amount of money that the HEA provided to our institutions did not cover in full the extra staff costs that we had to pay out. So our universities, in fact, they lost money on the national pay round last year, if you want to put it in very bald and simple terms. And they are the realities. So what we're saying is, if whatever package comes through in the coming weeks, and you know, if there's a political decision taken to reduce student contributions, you know, that's a political decision, and I think Can I just ask you on that, has there been any formal communications from the Minister around what the impact of that might be, or around planning for that? Well, the only communication was in the Oireachtas. He confirmed that it would cost an extra €81 million a year for a €1,000 drop in student contribution, but there's been no other engagement in that. I think the question arises then that if there is a reduction, then there needs to be a commensurate filling of that gap by the state, in addition to filling the gap that's already there. And I do think, though, the needs of students must be paramount here, and I think in our submission we've made it very clear that we believe that student supports in the form of SUSI grants must be a significant part of the package as well. And we believe that the support should go to where they're needed most. And I said in my submission, it is unacceptable, I believe, in 2022 in Ireland that a student's educational future is determined by their postcode. And I think, therefore, the reform package must address that issue as well within the overall.
Can I just ask you, how do other countries, so many other countries, manage not to have student fees at all and yet to have a very high standard of third-level education?
Well, they spend an awful lot more on their systems. So, I mean, if you look at comparable smaller countries, I mean, if you look at the proportion of their GDP that they spend on third-level education, it is in some, well, in the best examples, it's 2.5 times better than Ireland. And so you go to places like Finland, Norway, Denmark and so on. But also smaller, emerging countries like Estonia are doing better than us in this regard.
So it can be done.
It can be
done even in nations and member states that we think maybe we're a lot less wealthy than this country is. So I think so. That's just important to state. Right.
Thanks very much, Deputy, for the questions. And again, just to echo what Jim said, so I won't labour the points. We've pressed for the publication, as you have, for what's come back from Europe. I think it would make for a much better conversation. And it goes, Jim mentioned a package, and I don't for a moment doubt that there's a lot of work going on between DFERS and DEPR on this. And certainly that's, we have indication, but we have no sort of definite news on that. But it does bring up the question of whether we're going to have a decision or a debate. And I think this is such a complex area and it's so important for the country that, my own view is that we need a debate around this. And it needs to be an inclusive debate. I think the genius of the Irish people is that we want a Rolls-Royce service with a LADA outlay. It goes to the heart of your question. And the truth is our system, as was acknowledged by Deputy Farrell, I think our system has done very, very well. But increasingly think of what it could do, with a little bit more. And I think that's always the way. It goes back to the point, I think Deputy Farrell was making the point I made in my own submission. It's really about prioritisation here. And when it comes down to the hard politics of it, and when you look at housing and when you look at health service and you look at education, it's the question of how we make our case. So going back to your question on the metrics, I think Jim and I could possibly do a bit of work on that and come back to you and try and give you some substantial ammunition on this. I'm very happy to do this. And it goes to your point about, how do you reconcile this funding issue? I mean, the truth is it's a pot of funding that's not sufficient with an increasing number of students. Now, there is a move to encourage students into other areas, the apprenticeship, which is absolutely correct, into further education, etc. But students will vote as they vote. And then overriding all of this, of course, are things like Sustainable Development Goal, and particularly Sustainable Development Goal 4, which talks about access and equity for everyone. And then we're talking about regional sustainability, etc. So it's a complex mix, and it seems to me to invite a fuller conversation. Thank you.
Can I maybe just ask you the impact of the funding situation as it is and the debt being 1 billion across the board, what impact that has on the development of on-campus accommodation?
Well, if I could, from our sector, we don't have on-campus accommodation.
I understand that. And maybe just to ask you, sorry, Professor Ryan, what is stopping that at the moment? Because I know it's been agreed across the board that the borrowing, that we're going to enable borrowing for the technological universities. Why isn't it happening just right now?
It's there in the Act, as I said. It needs to be triggered. There is an openness to this, and in fairness to the department, they have invited. So we have set up a working group that's looking at that under the Secretary General. The difficulty now is the economics of it are not making sense. So that's why it would need some assistance from government to make sense. In other words, the cost to the student, if you built this and then rented it out, would be too high for the student cohort. So the impact is on opportunity, it's on equity, and we saw, if I may, Chairman, very briefly, we saw through COVID where we were bringing in, like Jim and I were involved in talks around this, and even international students. And where would you put them? You know, we were talking at one stage about City West. You know, and it just pointed up the fact that we don't have the infrastructure there at times, and that there's an element there, Chairman, about resilience and about learning. You know, it seems to me. Thanks.